63% of Americans shop emotionally. Not because they need something, but because they feel something pulling them toward the cart. More than half admit they buy to relieve stress, and nearly half confess these little treats have damaged their finances and pushed them into debt they never planned. The average person loses $282 every month to impulses born from boredom, loneliness, or that quiet ache after a long day. This is not a personal failure. This is your brain following ancient survival rules in a world of endless discounts and one-click buttons. You know the feeling. That evening scroll where your phone seems to open itself, promising relief in a cozy blanket or gadget you did not need yesterday. The final sale timer ticking down, making your heart race like you will miss the last helicopter out of danger. The Instagram story of someone else's perfect life, followed by a purchase that feels like catching up. Tomorrow morning, packages arrive and regret settles in. But the cycle repeats because you do not yet see the patterns. This book reveals the 10 unmistakable signs that you are buying emotions, not needs. Each chapter uncovers one hidden trigger with real statistics, brain science, and simple experiments you can try tonight. You will recognize yourself in every page, understand exactly why your brain betrays you, and discover that freedom comes not from complex systems or iron discipline, but from 3 simple rules anyone can follow. Imagine finishing this book knowing exactly when your brain tricks you into spending, spotting the patterns before they cost you another $200, and replacing the cart with choices that actually fill the real void. Real people have done this, not through budgets or apps, but by understanding their own wiring. You are about to see the science behind your evenings, your urges, your regrets. And by the end, you will have 3 rules that end the cycle forever. Start recognizing these signs today, because awareness is the first step out of the trap. Chapter 1. The Evening Ritual. Where your brain slips into spending mode. 8 in the evening. It is a strange hour. Too late to stay productive, too early to fall asleep, and just quiet enough for your mind to replay the day like a highlight reel you did not ask to watch. Across the United States, this single window of time has become the most profitable moment for online stores. More than half of all emotional purchases happen after work, long after your energy has drained and the part of the mind responsible for careful decisions starts to dim. You are not imagining the pull. It is a biological shift, something millions slip into every night without noticing. Imagine a typical weekday. The light in the room softens, the house settles, and your shoulders drop under the weight of everything you carried since morning. The to-do list is finally behind you, but the tension refuses to stop buzzing under the skin. Your phone lights up. One tap, then another. And suddenly the world fills with gentle colors, cozy rooms, limited time offers, and those curated images of lives where everything seems easy. Your body reads it like a promise. Ease, warmth, something pleasant without effort. Researchers tracking evening shopping habits notice something striking. After 8 p.m., the brain begins to lean heavily on instinct instead of analysis. Glucose drops, mental endurance thins, and the reward system starts searching for something, anything, that feels like comfort. When you combine this shift with the design of modern platforms, the result becomes predictable. The brain sees an ad for a blanket or a pair of headphones, and instead of wondering whether they are necessary, it starts imagining the relief attached to them. The object becomes a tiny rescue boat drifting toward you. Click. Add to cart. The motion feels soft and reassuring, almost therapeutic. People often describe the process the same way. I wasn't even thinking. Or, I just needed something small to end the day on a better note. That part is important. Evening purchases are rarely about the item. They are about the moment. The little ceremony of telling yourself that the hard part of the day is finally over. A private reward ceremony no one else sees. Over time, that small reward links itself to the hour, and the brain begins to treat the ritual as a tradition. Picture someone sitting on the edge of their couch after a long shift. The room is dim, the phone screen bright. They scroll without intention, pausing only when a familiar wave of relief washes through their chest at the sight of something soft, something discounted, something new. The purchase feels gentle and deserved, almost like a warm drink on a cold night. It is easy to believe this moment is a choice made in full awareness. In reality, the brain is leaning toward the fastest path to comfort, and shopping happens to be within reach. There is a deeper reason the ritual forms so quickly. Emotional memory is sticky. When the brain experiences a fast hit of relief, especially at the end of a stressful day, it stores the sequence as effective. Not good, not practical, not necessary. Just effective. The next evening, when the same tension returns, the brain searches for the familiar path again. The more often the behavior repeats, the thinner the pause becomes between the urge and the action. Eventually, it feels like the phone moves first, as if your hands remember the ritual faster than your thoughts. A group of psychologists ran a week-long experiment where participants logged every impulse purchase with a timestamp and a short note about what they felt in the moment. By day 3, a pattern surfaced. People were not writing about desire for products. They were writing about fatigue, irritability, numbness, restlessness, or the peculiar emptiness that comes after holding yourself together all day. The purchase acted like punctuation, a small emotional exhale, something that briefly softened the edges of the evening. Once the pattern becomes visible, the ritual loses its invisibility. Awareness has a strange power here. You do not need discipline or strict rules to interrupt the cycle. You only need clarity. The next time your thumb hovers over a buy button, pay attention to the sensation behind it. Are you seeking relief? Company? A sense of ending the day with something pleasant? There is always an emotion present, and once you notice which one governs the moment, the whole ritual becomes easier to slow down. There is a simple exercise that reveals more than you expect. For just 1 week, write down the approximate time of every purchase or near purchase. That is all. No judgment, no rules, no pressure to change anything. Most people discover that their spending is not scattered throughout the day. It clusters around the same hour, often in the same room, under the same emotional conditions. The recognition alone shifts the experience. The moment that felt automatic now has edges and definition. You can see where the impulse begins instead of waking up in the aftermath. Evening spending is not a flaw or a lack of willpower. It is a rhythm your brain has learned, a pairing of exhaustion and reward that grows stronger each time it is repeated. When you step into awareness, that rhythm starts to loosen. You begin to feel the difference between wanting rest and reaching for the nearest shortcut. You start recognizing the urge earlier, in that tiny second where choice still exists. And here lies the real turning point. When you look closely, the evening ritual does not disappear. It transforms. You start asking better questions. What would feel soothing right now? What is the real ache beneath this urge? What would help me end this day in a way that actually restores me? Shopping becomes one option among many instead of the automatic one. Tonight, when the room quiets and the familiar pull returns, pause for a moment before the scroll begins. Not to stop yourself, but to watch what happens. That single pause is the first crack in the cycle, the moment where evening spending stops being instinct and starts becoming something you can guide. Chapter 2. Buying Loneliness. When silence becomes a marketplace, loneliness rarely walks through the front door. It prefers quieter entrances, slipping into the room sometime between the moment you take off your shoes and the moment you realize the house hasn't heard a voice in hours. Most people would never describe themselves as lonely. They say they're tired, or done with the day, or simply want something pleasant before bed. But if you trace the path of late evening purchases, the pattern reveals a different story. Researchers studying emotional spending notice that the urge to shop often appears long before the desire for any specific item. It starts as a sensation, a slight heaviness in the chest, a restless shift of attention, a need for contact that has nowhere to land. When silence persists long enough, the brain begins scanning for anything that feels like connection. That is when online stores gain their strange emotional power. There is a reason soft products dominate impulse purchases in the evening. Warm blankets, candles, gentle lighting, cozy loungewear, plush textures, items that create atmosphere. These categories surge in sales when people spend their nights alone. Their appeal is not functional. They represent comfort, presence, warmth. They create an echo of human closeness in a room that feels too still. Picture an ordinary evening. Someone closes the door behind them after a long day, drops their bag, and listens for a moment. The apartment is quiet. Dinner happens quickly, maybe without a plate, maybe while standing by the counter. Hours pass without conversation. The quiet grows denser, almost physical. At some point, the phone lights up. A thumb drifts toward an app without intention. The store opens, and suddenly the room feels less empty. Colors move, gentle descriptions appear, suggestions appear at the bottom of the screen. You might like this. Trending in your area. Selected for you. The person scanning these items isn't looking for a product. They're looking for a feeling, something that softens the edges of the evening. And in the moment, the algorithm behaves like a form of attention. A set of curated objects appears as if someone took the time to pick them. The brain accepts the illusion with surprising ease. After all, humans are wired to seek signals of comfort long before they seek practicality. One participant in a spending study described her nightly habit this way. I scroll because it feels like someone is showing me things. It makes the room feel less empty. She lived alone, had a stable career, and prided herself on her independence. But her spending logs showed a precise trend. The quieter the evening, the fuller her cart became. Another participant wrote something similar, though he phrased it differently. I buy decorative things I never use. They make the apartment feel like someone else might walk in. His purchases weren't about usefulness. They were attempts to rewrite the atmosphere of a silent home. When people spend several nights in a row without meaningful interaction, the brain recalibrates. It seeks micro-stimulation, tiny sparks of engagement to break through the monotony. A new object provides exactly that. A small emotional lift, a moment of color, a brief sense of novelty. The mind records this reaction quickly. It doesn't evaluate long-term value. It records the short-term relief. In doing so, it builds a quiet association between loneliness and shopping. This explains why late-night purchases feel logical while they're happening and oddly out of place the next morning. The item belonged to an emotional moment, not to a practical need. When the moment passes, the object loses its meaning. People often unbox something they bought the night before. and feel a strange distance from it, as though someone else made the decision. There's another layer to this pattern. Silence changes how the body processes time. During quiet nights, minutes expand, thoughts slow down, and the mind becomes more aware of internal sensations. Emotional needs feel louder. The simplest way to mute that inner noise is to fill the moment with motion. Scrolling, browsing, adding to cart. The action itself becomes soothing. Even before the purchase is completed, the process has already delivered the comfort it promised. Eventually, the behavior can start to feel automatic. Many people describe the same moment. They look at a filled cart and genuinely cannot recall selecting half the items. They weren't choosing, they were coping. The store interface served as a soft distraction from an evening that felt too empty. If you look closely, the purchases chosen during lonely nights share similar themes. Items that create warmth, items that change the atmosphere, items that add texture, light, or softness. The brain isn't searching for things. It's searching for emotional temperature. And temperature is something objects can imitate, even if they cannot truly provide it. The emotional pull of loneliness becomes even stronger when the day carried small disappointments. The unread message, the half-finished conversation, the moment when you hoped someone would ask how you were doing, but no one did. These fragments accumulate quietly. They don't feel dramatic, yet they shape the texture of the night. When a person sits in a room where these quiet aches have nowhere to go, the mind begins to improvise. Shopping apps become a kind of doorway, not into spending, but into distraction, into companionship that exists only for the duration of the scroll. Researchers mapping brain activity found that loneliness changes which regions activate when people look at comforting items. Areas responsible for social bonding light up in response to cozy imagery, almost as if the brain mistakes warmth for connection. A candle isn't a person, yet the photograph of its glow creates an echo of what people usually feel when someone sits beside them. A plush blanket isn't a hug, but the texture imitates the gesture closely enough to satisfy the brain for a moment. This overlap is subtle, but powerful. When the mind is deprived of human warmth, it becomes more receptive to symbolic warmth. That is why the late-night browsing ritual feels soothing long before a purchase happens. The relief doesn't come from owning anything. It comes from imagining a room made gentler, from the possibility of comfort, from the tiny fantasy of being surrounded by softness and light. These images function like emotional placeholders, giving the mind a temporary sense of belonging. And when the purchase feels good, even briefly, the brain tags the entire sequence as a workable strategy. It is not ideal, but it is effective in the moment. There's a story one therapist tells about a client who repeatedly bought throw blankets. Not one or two, but over a dozen in 4 months. Each blanket was folded neatly on a shelf, still wrapped in its original packaging. When asked why she kept buying them, the woman hesitated. Then she said something that surprised even her. Blankets feel like people, not literally, just they make the room softer. She lived alone after a difficult breakup and had not yet learned how to inhabit that silence. The blankets were her way of inviting warmth without facing the vulnerability of wanting it. Versions of this story appear everywhere in emotional spending research. People buy lighting they never adjust, decorative pillows they don't lean on, books they never open, aromatherapy oils they rarely use. These objects serve a symbolic purpose. They transform the environment into something that feels less empty, even if the transformation exists only in imagination. The moment the object is added to the cart, the mind experiences a small shift. The night no longer feels so stark. Something is coming. Something warm. Something that changes the atmosphere. But when the package arrives the next day, the emotional purpose has already expired. Morning light makes the purchase look different. The silence is thinner during daylight. Loneliness loosens its grip. People unpack the item and feel a faint confusion, as if the object belonged to someone else's mood. This is the disconnect that frustrates so many. The purchase felt meaningful at night, so why does it feel ordinary now? Psychologists call this context fade. Emotional decisions made in one state of mind lose their meaning in another. At night, the purchase answered an emotion. In the morning, the emotion is gone, leaving behind the object but not the reason. This cycle becomes especially strong when a person's social world has shrunk. After a breakup, after moving to a new city, after a change in friendships, after a period of burnout that made interactions feel exhausting. During these transitions, evenings can feel unfamiliar, like entering a house you once lived in but no longer recognize. The mind tries to anchor itself, and objects become anchors. Not anchors to stability, but to sensation, a momentary feeling of warmth. Sometimes the impulse emerges even earlier, during the first signs of solitude. A person walks into their home and feels the air shift. They turn on music, but it doesn't land quite right. They cook dinner, but the flavors seem muted. They scroll through news feeds, hoping to stumble upon something that sparks connection. When none of these soften the atmosphere, the mind begins reaching for the simplest form of emotional stimulation, novelty wrapped in comfort. This is why browsing stores becomes a ritual rather than a task. Each swipe offers a new texture, a new color, a new possibility. The action absorbs the loneliness for a few minutes. It creates movement in an evening that feels static. Even before the cart fills, the ritual has already provided relief. But the pattern complicates life in subtle ways. The room begins filling with objects chosen for moods that no longer exist. Shelves hold items that solved a feeling, not a problem. Drawers accumulate small comforts that never got the chance to comfort anything. The environment becomes warmer in theory, yet the inner landscape stays the same. Awareness is the first point of shift. When a person realizes their purchases cluster around the quietest hours, something inside them clicks into place. The behavior stops feeling random. It becomes understandable. Loneliness is no longer disguised. It becomes visible. This visibility does not erase the feeling. It does something far more useful. It separates the emotion from the impulse. Instead of letting the silence guide the hand toward a purchase, the person begins noticing the moment the silence tightens. A small pause appears, a breath, a question. What do I actually want right now? Often the answer surprises people. They want a voice. They want a message. They want someone to sit with them, even briefly. They want their presence to matter to someone else. They want gentleness. They want warmth that cannot be delivered by a courier. Once that emotional truth is acknowledged, even silently, even privately, the urge changes character. It becomes negotiable. The person might still choose to buy something, yet the purchase carries clarity rather than ache. And sometimes, instead of buying, they send a message to a friend, or step outside for a walk, or turn on a lamp that casts warmer light, or make a cup of tea and let the steam fill the silence with a softer rhythm. Loneliness isn't a flaw, it's a signal, a human one. It asks for connection, not consumption. It asks for presence, not packages. When a person learns to hear this signal clearly, their evenings shift in subtle but powerful ways. The room doesn't feel as heavy. The silence loses its edge. The urge to fill it with objects loosens. And for the first time in a long time, the night feels like a place where they can simply exist, rather than a space they need to escape. This is the turning point. Not a rule, not a system, not a restriction, just awareness. The kind that gives someone the ability to meet their real needs instead of soothing their temporary ache. The kind that transforms shopping from a coping mechanism into a choice. The kind that makes a quiet evening feel less like an empty room and more like a pause in a life that still has warmth waiting for it. The silence is still there, but now it has company. Your attention, your understanding, your presence. And in that presence, the cycle begins to unravel. Chapter 3. The discount illusion. When urgency hijacks your mind, there is a moment in the shopping experience that feels almost electric. A red badge flashes. A timer blinks. The words, "last chance," "limited stock," or "ending soon" appear on the screen with the confidence of someone whispering a secret in your ear. Even when the day felt controlled and grounded, this small visual spark can change everything. 76% of people admit they have bought something simply because it looked like the opportunity was slipping away. The item wasn't urgent. The feeling was. Urgency alters the brain's internal priorities. When you see a countdown or a disappearing offer, your amygdala becomes more active. This is the part of the brain that reacts to potential loss with a burst of alertness, the same region that lights up when someone senses danger. Stores have learned to borrow this biological mechanism, not by scaring you, but by turning a routine purchase into a moment that feels consequential. The discount becomes more than a price reduction. It becomes a race against time. Imagine this scenario. You are calm, scrolling casually, with no intention of buying anything at all. Then a banner appears. Ends in 38 minutes. There is no pressure from the outside world, but something inside your chest shifts. Your breath changes, even if only slightly. A sensation of haste ripples through you. You begin imagining the item as something you already own. The new lamp on your desk, the jacket hanging in your closet, the gadget that could make your mornings easier. The mind leaps forward into the after, and once you've pictured the object in your life, losing the deal feels like losing something tangible. This is the discount illusion. The urgency convinces your brain that you are about to miss out on an experience rather than a product. And the sensation of losing an experience feels personal. During one behavioral experiment, researchers asked people to track the emotions they felt when looking at timed deals. The results were surprisingly universal. People described a slight quickening of attention, a warm rush through the arms, a feeling of leaning toward the screen. These bodily reactions happened before any conscious thoughts. The sense of urgency wasn't created by logic. It emerged from instinct. Timed discounts also trigger a mental shortcut called action bias. When the brain faces a situation with limited time, it prefers doing something over doing nothing. This is a survival strategy built from thousands of years of responding to fast-moving threats. In a digital store, there is no threat, but the system reacts the same way. The mind chooses action. Click, add to cart, secure the deal. Not because the item is needed, but because the brain dislikes sitting still when a clock is ticking. Picture a typical evening shopper. They glance at a pair of headphones discounted for the next half hour. They don't truly need them. They already own a pair. Yet something nudges them to imagine the regret of hesitating. The brain exaggerates the sense of potential loss, turning a harmless delay into an emotional risk. By the time the shopper tries to slow down, the fear of missing out has already built its momentum. FOMO, the fear of missing out, was originally a social concept, linked to the worry that others were experiencing something exciting without you. But in the world of online shopping, FOMO has evolved into a psychological tool. Stores create artificial scarcity to make you imagine a crowd of invisible buyers who might take your deal first. Even when you are shopping alone, your brain is subtly convinced that others are watching the same item, competing silently, rushing toward the same clock. The urgency becomes social, not financial. There's another layer most people never notice. The discount itself often plays a smaller role than the story your mind creates around it. A sweater that suddenly drops from $80 to $35 looks more appealing not because of its quality, but because the contrast creates a jolt of reward. The brain calculates savings as if it were income, a strange trick of perception that makes you feel like you've earned money by spending it. This is why discounted items feel emotionally satisfying. The purchase feels like a smart triumph, even when the logic doesn't hold. One participant in a spending study described the experience clearly. "If I hesitate, I feel like the universe punishes me. If I buy it, I feel clever." The researchers were struck by this phrasing. It captured something essential. Urgency transforms shopping into a moral storyline, where hesitation becomes failure and action becomes victory. The most surprising discovery from these studies is how deeply urgency shapes memory. People who bought items under pressure later recalled the moment as exciting rather than stressful. The thrill overshadowed the regret. This emotional editing protects the ritual. It encourages the person to repeat the behavior the next time a discount flashes at them. Online stores are aware of this cycle, and they design their interfaces accordingly. They introduce countdowns that restart each day. They display only 4 left, even when the warehouse is full. They highlight disappearing offers that return every weekend. Each tactic is crafted to produce the same internal response: a rush of possibility, a borrowed sense of importance, a brief illusion that something meaningful is unfolding. And all of it happens within seconds, before logic has time to intervene. The deeper researchers explored urgency, the clearer the pattern became. The brain reacts to disappearing deals the way it reacts to sudden shifts in the environment. Even a small flashing timer creates a moment of heightened awareness. This response is ancient. Long before online stores existed, humans survived by paying attention to things that would not last: daylight, food sources, seasonal opportunities. The modern interface borrows this survival code and compresses it into a bright button, promising a temporary advantage. This is why a discount can feel strangely emotional. The person scrolling late at night is already operating on reduced mental energy. Their guard is lower, their decisions softer, and their desire for closure stronger. Urgency steps in as a shortcut. Instead of evaluating the object, the mind evaluates the moment. The moment appears fleeting. Fleeting things feel important. In interviews, people described a similar sensation when facing a disappearing deal. A quick tilt of the body, a subtle forward lean, an instinct to move closer as if the item might physically slip away. These reactions are so consistent that neurologists began calling them micro-chases. The mind interprets urgency as movement, and movement demands a response. Even small countdowns create this internal chase, pulling the shopper into a state of low-grade pursuit. One woman in a study explained it in simple words. "I suddenly feel like I'm running out of something. I don't know what, but I'm running out." She said this while describing a sale on kitchen organizers she never planned to buy. This sense of running out intensifies when the interface shows imaginary competitors. Labels like 40 people watching, almost gone, or selling fast, create the illusion of a crowd just out of sight. The shopper isn't alone anymore. They are in a silent race with people who do not exist, yet the pressure feels real inside the body. The moment transforms from a decision into a contest. Novelty adds another layer. When a discount appears suddenly, the brain experiences a small spark of surprise. Surprise pushes dopamine upward, creating a burst of attentiveness. The shopper feels a pleasant jolt, something like the emotional flicker of discovering a hidden shortcut. The purchase becomes a story, a catch, a win, a clever moment. This is why the act feels addictive. It isn't the item. It's the sensation of being quick enough to capture something that seems rare. The companies behind these interfaces understand the psychology intimately. Some platforms refresh their "only a few left" counters multiple times per day. Others reset their timers at random intervals to create the illusion of unpredictability. The system is designed to feel alive, as though the deals are breathing, shifting, slipping through the fingers of slower shoppers. The more dynamic the page appears, the stronger the sense of urgency. There is an overlooked detail in all of this. When a person buys something impulsively due to a discount, they rarely regret the price. They regret the rush, the sense that they acted under a spell. Yet that same spell becomes part of the thrill, which is why the behavior repeats. Memory edits out the discomfort and keeps the excitement. Over time, the shopper begins associating urgency with a kind of emotional spark. They chase it, not consciously, but as part of a pattern the mind now treats as rewarding. The presence of a timer also changes how people view necessity. A person may think, "I don't need this right now," but the brain quickly offers a different reasoning. "I might need it later." Future need thinking is one of the most powerful distortions created by urgency. The shopper imagines themselves months ahead, grateful that they acted at the right moment. That imagined future becomes an emotional anchor for the present decision. This distorted imagination encourages people to picture a version of themselves who uses the item regularly, who is organized, calm, efficient, stylish, creative, whatever the product promises. The timer amplifies this fantasy, compressing the future into a narrow window. The shopper isn't just buying a discounted item. They are attempting to buy a better version of themselves before the door closes. Because of this effect, people often describe urgency-based purchases as strangely personal. The item feels tied to their identity, even when that identity dissolves in the morning. The discount does not shape who they are. It shapes who they momentarily believe they could become. When researchers asked people to revisit these purchases weeks later, many reported a sense of emotional distance. The item looked ordinary, sometimes unnecessary, occasionally puzzling. But the memory of the purchase still glowed faintly. The moment had been exciting. The rush had felt meaningful. The body remembered the thrill more than the object itself. This is the trap hidden inside urgency. It creates memories of excitement, not usefulness. And excitement is easier to crave than practicality. Understanding this mechanism does not immediately weaken it, but it creates a different kind of awareness. The next time a countdown appears, the shopper may notice the shift inside their chest. They may feel the forward lean, the sudden quickening of attention, the whisper of imagined loss. These sensations are not commands. They are signals, evidence of an ancient system reacting to a modern trick. Recognition creates space. Space interrupts the chase. And in that interruption, the mind recovers its clarity. Chapter 4. Buying Anger. When frustration spills into the cart, anger has a way of bursting into the smallest corners of life. It does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives as a tightness in the stomach, a heat behind the eyes, a restless urge to move, to act, to change something immediately. After an argument or a tense moment, the body fills with a sharp kind of energy that refuses to sit quietly. Emotional spending rises dramatically in these moments. Studies show that after a conflict, people increase their impulsive purchases by more than a third. The trigger is not the item itself. It is the surge underneath. When the brain experiences anger, adrenal activity increases. The body prepares for confrontation, even when the conflict has already ended. Muscles stay alert. Breathing becomes shorter. The mind searches for a target, something that absorbs the excess charge. In ancient environments, this reaction made sense. Anger signaled danger, and the body needed a quick way to release tension. In the modern world, especially late at night, the body still prepares for action. But there is nowhere to direct that force. Shopping steps into the empty space. Imagine someone arguing with a partner or a friend. The conversation ends, but the emotion does not. It lingers in the chest like a burning ember. The person walks into another room, picks up their phone, and opens an app without thinking. They begin scanning products quickly, impatiently, almost aggressively. The experience feels strangely satisfying, a small rebellion, a way to reclaim control. The item added to the cart becomes a symbolic gesture. I deserve something after this. The purchase is not about want. It is about release. People often describe this state in similar ways. I just needed to do something. My mind was buzzing. I wanted to feel like I was choosing something for myself. These statements reveal a crucial truth. Spending in moments of anger is an action disguised as self-care. The brain craves movement, and buying provides motion. Even the swipe of a finger feels purposeful. Neurologists have tracked how anger changes reward processing. When adrenaline rises, the brain becomes more sensitive to fast rewards and less interested in long-term reasoning. That is why angry shoppers choose things that feel bold, expressive, indulgent, or symbolic. They want items that match the inner intensity. A striking jacket, a dramatic lamp, a powerful scent, a new gadget that feels sharp and decisive. The object becomes an extension of the emotion. One participant in a behavioral study wrote, "I shop when I feel disrespected." They didn't mean they wanted material compensation. They meant the purchase gave them a sense of reclaiming their worth. Anger often carries a hidden wound, the feeling of being unseen, unheard, misunderstood. Buying something becomes a way to shout without making a sound. Anger also shrinks the pause between impulse and action. During calmer states, the mind evaluates. During anger, the mind accelerates. Thought moves in straight lines. The body wants motion, and the cart becomes the easiest direction. This is why the same person who normally hesitates suddenly presses buy with no second thought. The emotional charge takes up all available space. After conflicts, something else happens. The brain tries to soothe the ego. Emotional pain makes people crave gestures of self-validation, small symbols that say, "You matter." Retail therapy thrives on that moment. A new object feels like a personal reward for surviving a stressful interaction. But since the purchase answers an emotion rather than a need, the relief fades quickly. Picture a quiet evening after a heated conversation. The room feels too still. The chest is tight. Thoughts replay the argument in loops. The mind insists on closure, but closure does not arrive. The shopper adds items to the cart rapidly, as if the speed could erase the tension. For a brief moment, the rush works. The attention shifts. The sting softens. The anger feels less sharp. Buying becomes a pressure valve. Many people don't realize that anger-based spending has a distinct pattern. The items chosen in these moments tend to be louder, more expressive, more dramatic than what the person usually buys. They often reflect who the person wishes they were in the moment: confident, unbothered, powerful. The purchase becomes a costume for an emotion rather than a choice for the future. Yet the next morning, the object often feels mismatched. The bold jacket hangs in the closet untouched. The dramatic decor looks out of place. The edgy accessory no longer fits the person's mood. This disconnect creates a quiet shame. Not because the person bought something, but because the purchase belonged to an emotional version of themselves that existed for only a few minutes. Anger makes decisions feel urgent, even when nothing about the situation requires urgency. The emotional heat tricks the mind into acting fast. When the body carries that much intensity, slowing down feels impossible. Movement feels like survival. But beneath the speed lies something tender: the wish to feel soothed, empowered, protected, or simply acknowledged. The mind reaches for objects because they are available, controllable, immediate. The real need is deeper, and the second half of this chapter will reveal how to recognize it as it forms. Before the cart becomes a place of emotional escape. Anger reshapes attention in a way few emotions can. After a conflict, or even a small irritation, the senses sharpen. Colors feel brighter, sounds feel harsher, and the mind becomes alert, scanning for resolution. This heightened state makes the body restless. People often pace, open and close drawers, move from room to room without purpose. Shopping adds direction to that energy. It gives the emotion somewhere to land. In several studies, participants described the same chain of sensations: a heat rising through the chest, a need to take control of something, and a craving for a fast, decisive action. This is why the act of choosing becomes so enticing. Scrolling gives rhythm to the agitation. Tapping gives structure. The act of adding an item to a cart feels like stepping out of helplessness. Each movement creates the illusion of progress. During these moments, the brain assigns exaggerated meaning to objects. A bold accessory can feel like strength. A stylish coat can feel like dignity. A new perfume can feel like reclaiming identity. People do not consciously think this way. The emotional charge paints the world in symbolic colors, and the shopping interface becomes a stage where the person rewrites the ending of the argument they just lived through. One shopper described it like this: "When I'm angry, I want something that proves I'm worth more than how that person treated me." The purchase was not a reward. It was a message, even if no one would ever hear it. This dynamic becomes even stronger when the anger is mixed with humiliation or disappointment. The mind rushes to restore a sense of self-respect. Buying something feels like a declaration. The moment hurt, but the person still has power. This is why many people choose items that look dramatic or luxurious, things that carry emotional weight. The price often climbs during these episodes. Researchers noticed that the more intense the anger, the more expensive the items. The mind equates cost with significance. But when the adrenaline fades, the symbolism dissolves. A dramatic purchase chosen in the heat of emotion becomes confusing in the calm of mourning. The inner fire that made the object feel necessary has cooled. The shopper sees the item clearly for the first time without the emotional filter and often feels disconnected from it. This is the quiet aftermath of anger-based spending. People rarely regret the item itself. They regret how far the emotion reached into their decisions. Another subtle mechanism unfolds here. Anger demands a narrative. Conflict awakens the storytelling part of the brain, the part that wants to make sense of the situation, to understand who was right, who was wrong, who should have spoken differently. This creates mental loops that are hard to escape. Shopping interrupts the loop for a moment. The brain shifts from emotional analysis to sensory engagement. Textures, colors, prices, shapes. These details break the cycle of replaying the argument. Even if only briefly, the mind rests. One participant in a long-term study wrote, "Buying something is the only way I can stop thinking about the fight." This was not about material comfort. This was emotional anesthesia. But anesthetics wear off. The mental story returns once the transaction ends, leaving behind both the original frustration and the purchase made under its influence. This is why awareness becomes essential. Not resistance, not rules. Awareness. Anger has a recognizable rhythm. It rises quickly, hits a peak, and then begins to break apart. The peak is where most emotional purchases occur. The person feels overwhelmed by intensity and tries to regain equilibrium through swift action. If they can catch the moment when the urge begins, the spark before the flame, the entire cycle shifts. During the early stages of anger, the body sends out signals. Shoulders tense, breathing shortens. Thoughts rush forward too quickly. The impulse to move becomes almost physical. This is the window where emotional spending takes root. When a person notices these sensations, they gain a chance to redirect the energy before it spills into the cart. This does not mean resisting emotion. It means acknowledging it before it chooses the path for you. For many people, simply naming the feeling softens it. Frustration, hurt, disappointment. Once the emotion has a clear shape, the urge to buy begins to lose its urgency. Another approach emerges from behavioral research, shifting the focus from action to sensation. When anger pushes the body forward, pausing to feel the ground beneath the feet or the weight of the hands interrupts the momentum. The pause does not erase the emotion, yet it prevents the instinctive leap toward a purchase. But the most powerful shift happens when a person sees the real longing beneath the anger. The desire to be respected, the desire to be understood, the desire to feel valued, the desire to feel safe inside the relationship or situation that sparked the conflict. None of these needs can be met through an impulsive purchase. The moment that truth becomes clear, the impulse loses its ability to dictate behavior. Picture the scene again. The argument is over. The room is still. The phone is in hand. The shopping app waits. Before the first swipe, the person senses the lingering heat in their chest. They breathe once, slowly. They acknowledge the ache of the moment. They understand the emotion rather than letting it drive the action. The cart stays empty. The emotion does not vanish, but it no longer shapes the night. Anger carries power. When that power is recognized rather than escaped, it becomes easier to choose actions that support well-being instead of purchases that echo frustration. The second half of this book will show how to replace these reflexes with rituals that calm the body and restore clarity. But even now, in the middle of this chapter, something important has already begun. The ability to see anger before it spills into costly decisions. And once you see it, you cannot unknow it. Chapter 5. Tired minds. Heavy carts. When exhaustion pretends to be. Desire. Exhaustion creates a world of its own. It arrives quietly, without drama, settling into the muscles after a day spent making decisions, absorbing pressure, answering messages, and navigating small emotional storms that no one else sees. By evening, the mind drifts. Attention scatters, and the body carries a weight that makes every choice feel twice as heavy. In these hours, spending rises sharply. Research shows that after 10 hours of continuous mental effort, people make far more impulsive purchases, guided by a craving for comfort rather than genuine interest in the object. When mental energy runs low, the brain struggles to separate relief from desire. The reward system becomes unusually sensitive, almost hungry for stimulation. A single glowing image on the screen triggers a small surge of clarity, a contrast to the fog inside the mind. This is why tired people gravitate toward items that promise coziness or order. A soft blanket, a warm lamp, a neatly designed planner, a gadget that looks like it could rescue the next morning. Each image carries a whisper of ease. Picture the end of a long weekday. A person steps into their home with shoulders slightly slumped, drops their bag, and breathes out slowly. There is no energy left for reflection. They sink into the couch and lift their phone because it requires less effort than being with their own thoughts. The screen lights up, and the first colorful image feels soothing. A kitchen tool that claims efficiency. A pair of slippers that look soft enough to erase the ache in the heels. A water bottle with perfect symmetry. In this moment, the brain is not evaluating usefulness. It is responding to the small spark each image creates. A participant in a behavioral study described this sensation in a single sentence. "When I'm tired, everything feels like an improvement." The researchers wrote notes around that line because it captured something essential. Exhaustion distorts value. Ordinary objects begin to shine the way lifeboats shine to someone stranded in choppy water. The tired mind sees solutions everywhere, even when the problems these objects claim to solve do not exist. Another common pattern appears during these evenings. Movement feels soothing. The simple rhythm of scrolling gives shape to the night. Details pass in front of the eyes, colors, textures, prices, shapes. The mind experiences microbursts of stimulation that cut through the fatigue. This is why people say they shop just to unwind. The act itself becomes a comfort, regardless of what ends up in the cart. Exhaustion changes time perception as well. Minutes lose definition, drifting into each other. Someone may browse for half an hour without feeling the passage of time. Decision-making becomes gentle, blurry, almost dreamlike. The path of least resistance feels like the only path available. Adding an item to the cart requires one motion. Thinking requires many. The tired brain takes the easier route. Imagine a quiet room with dim lighting, the kind of lighting that blurs the edges of everything. A person scrolls, eyelids heavy, thoughts slow. A self-care kit appears. Then a candle with calming scents. Then a set of organizers that promise to bring order into tomorrow. With each image, the chest loosens slightly. The relief is fleeting, but powerful enough to be mistaken for interest. The mind confuses the lift with desire. In moments like these, purchases happen almost silently. A thought appears. I should treat myself. Or something small would help. But beneath the surface, the emotion is simpler. The wish for comfort after carrying too much for too long. The body aches for rest, and the brain translates that ache into a shopping impulse, because the screen is the closest source of easy relief. This state shapes behavior more deeply than people realize. When someone is depleted, they lose access to the version of themselves who evaluates clearly, who plans, who questions, who considers long-term effects. The tired mind is guided by warmth, softness, ease, and anything that promises gentleness. The cart becomes a place where exhaustion tries to soothe itself. Tired perception twists even the meaning of need, and why the fog of fatigue convinces the brain that comfort must be purchased. As the night deepens, exhaustion begins shaping perception in ways that feel subtle but powerful. The tired brain becomes more trusting, more suggestible, more willing to believe promises. A simple phrase like, makes mornings easier, lands with unusual force. A product that claims to save time feels like a gift. A gadget that appears efficient feels almost essential. The person isn't looking at the object. They're looking at the fantasy of relief attached to it. Neuroscientists call this the comfort projection effect. When the mind is depleted, it projects imagined ease onto whatever appears soothing. A tea kettle becomes a symbol of calm mornings. A new mattress cover becomes the hope of better sleep. A planner suggests clarity. A storage bin whispers order. None of these items guarantee real change, yet in the haze of fatigue, the brain fills them with emotional meaning. One participant in a long-term study wrote, "When I am tired, I look at things the way kids look at magic." This wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was the way a depleted nervous system clung to the idea of transformation. Another pattern emerges here. Exhaustion narrows focus. Instead of viewing a purchase as a long-term decision, the mind collapses everything into the present moment. The future blurs. The next morning doesn't exist yet. Only the heaviness exists, and the hope of something that might lift it. This is why people buy items they might need someday when they are tired. The tired mind imagines the future not as a timeline, but as a single doorway where comfort either exists or doesn't. The purchase becomes an attempt to secure comfort in advance. Picture someone scrolling through a late-night sale after a draining day. Their eyes linger on household items, organizational tools, skincare sets, mini appliances, soft clothes. They add more than they intend because each item promises to fix a tiny fragment of their life. The promises don't come from logic. They come from hope. The mind tries to rebuild its sense of control through objects that feel manageable. But when clarity returns in the morning, the emotional context disappears. The candle that felt like a lifeline looks ordinary in daylight. The plush slippers seem unnecessary. The high-tech device feels excessive. There is a sense of distance, as if someone else made the choices. This experience is so common that researchers gave it a name: fatigue amnesia. People remember the purchase, but not the feeling behind it. Some participants described unboxing items they didn't fully recall choosing. "I know I put it in the cart, but it feels like it wasn't me." It was them. Just a version of themselves shaped by exhaustion, chasing comfort with whatever tools were easiest to reach. There is another hidden dynamic at play. When a person is drained, their emotional boundaries weaken. They say yes more easily. They follow impulses with less resistance. They let images guide them because thinking feels too heavy. The cart becomes a resting place, a container for the day's weight. Even the decision to buy something small can feel like a relief. The mind interprets the click as momentum. After a day full of tasks someone had to do, this is finally a choice they get to make. The purchase becomes a moment of ownership in a day that consumed their energy. Yet beneath all of this, the true longing is simple. Rest, warmth, ease, a sense of being cared for. Exhaustion disguises these needs as desire for objects because objects are available and instant. The screen offers what the body cannot create for itself in that moment: a sense of softness. But softness rarely comes from things. It comes from the way someone treats themselves when they are depleted. And the moment a person recognizes the emotional nature of their late-night impulses, the power of the cart begins to loosen. When someone learns to feel the first signals of fatigue, the heaviness behind the eyes, the slower breathing, the way thoughts swim instead of walk, the impulse becomes easier to understand. Not to fight, to understand. because understanding creates a kind of inner steadiness. The urge becomes less mysterious, less gripping, less able to make decisions on its own. What follows from this awareness is not discipline. It is permission to rest before reaching for a substitute. Permission to breathe before scrolling. Permission to give the body what it truly needs instead of asking objects to do the job. In that small shift, evening spending loses its hold. The person begins recognizing that the cart is not a source of comfort. It is a mirror, reflecting the moments when life asked too much of them and rest felt out of reach. And once that truth becomes clear, the fog of exhaustion can no longer disguise itself as desire. Chapter 6. Mirrors of the Feed. How social comparison quietly empties your wallet. Social media paints the world in colors more intense than real life. Every scroll reveals someone's new outfit, someone's renovated kitchen, someone's perfectly organized desk, someone's glowing skin after a supposed miracle serum. At first, it feels harmless, even entertaining. But with each swipe, a slow shift takes place inside the mind. The brain does not simply observe these images, it compares. And comparison activates a quiet pressure that most people never notice until they open their banking app. Researchers discovered that certain platforms increase emotional spending by more than 27%, especially when people consume content filled with lifestyle imagery. The brain reacts to these images the way it reacts to real social groups. It evaluates status, belonging, and identity. When the feed shows endless scenes of curated lives, the mind begins to feel slightly behind, slightly less polished, slightly less complete. Picture an evening when someone has been scrolling for a while. They see a friend glowing on vacation, a stranger showing off minimalist decor, an influencer presenting a routine that looks effortless. None of this is malicious, yet something tightens subtly in the chest. A whisper forms. Maybe I should improve something too. This whisper is not envy. It is aspiration mixed with insecurity. Social comparison theory explains it clearly. When people see others who seem similar to them achieving small upgrades in lifestyle, the brain interprets those upgrades as socially expected steps. The mind says, "People like me have things like this." The cart begins to fill before the person understands why. A participant in a neuropsychology study described the experience in one sentence. "I don't want what they have. I want the feeling they seem to have." This distinction is crucial. Emotional spending in response to social media is rarely about the object. It is about chasing the emotional state the object represents. Confidence, ease, beauty, success, order, serenity. Imagine scrolling past a photo of a perfectly arranged nightstand with a glowing lamp and a stack of books. The image lasts only a second, but the brain reconstructs a story around it. A calmer life, a more intentional evening, a sense of balance. And when that story settles quietly into the mind, the shopper begins searching for items that match the atmosphere, not the photo. This is why people buy things that resemble what they saw. A soft lamp, a neutral-colored throw, a scented candle, a journal with clean lines. They are not replicating someone's life. They are attempting to replicate a feeling. There is also a neurological mechanism at play called upward evaluation. When the brain sees people it perceives as doing well, it triggers a mild cortisol rise. The body interprets this as a threat to social standing. Even a tiny threat is enough to activate the search for corrective action. Online stores appear as the most accessible correction. 3 clicks, and the person feels once again aligned with the version of themselves they believe they should be. One evening, A young woman in a research group scrolled through home decor videos and then, without hesitation, bought a set of curtains, a floor lamp, decorative pillows, and an organizer. She told researchers, "I didn't need any of it. I just felt like my life suddenly looked outdated." Her apartment had not changed in the last hour. Her feelings had. Social comparison also distorts scale. A perfectly curated room online is the result of professional lighting, editing, and staging. Yet the viewer's brain treats the scene as a natural baseline. Their own environment begins to feel inadequate, not because anything is wrong with it, but because the comparison is unfair. The unfairness doesn't stop the impulse. It fuels it. There is a psychological name for this: perceived lifestyle deficit. It emerges when the brain believes others have reached a standard you are supposed to meet as well. This silent expectation grows with every scroll. And once the deficit takes shape, spending begins to feel like self-correction. Picture someone lying in bed with dim lighting, scrolling late at night. Their room looks perfectly fine, but after 15 minutes of pristine images on the feed, the room begins to feel slightly dull, slightly outdated, slightly off. That emotional nudge, small as it is, generates a powerful urge to improve something immediately. A new blanket, a soft rug, a skincare product, a plant, a piece of wall art, something to shift the atmosphere, to shrink the gap between their life and the curated world unfolding on the screen. The brain mistakes the curated world for a mirror, and mirrors that distort can be expensive. The influence of the feed reaches farther than a simple sense of comparison. It shapes the way people evaluate themselves, long before they realize anything has shifted. The brain absorbs tone, mood, and symbolism with the same ease it absorbs color. And once these impressions settle, they begin to influence decisions that seem unrelated to what was seen minutes earlier. One of the most striking effects appears in the way people judge their progress. After spending time in a carefully edited digital world, ordinary days can begin to feel unfinished. Someone may look at a project they completed, a meal they cooked, a corner of their home they organized, and feel a faint sense of insufficiency. The task did not change. The standard did. Exposure to polished lives recalibrates the inner scale. Researchers call this subtle recalibration emotional displacement. The person no longer measures their life against their own values or goals. Instead, their mind drifts toward an imagined benchmark built from fragments of other people's curated moments. When this happens, purchases become attempts to bridge an invisible gap, the distance between who they are and who they momentarily believe they should be. Imagine someone watching a series of short videos showing office desks free of clutter, notebooks arranged in clean stacks, minimal screensavers, seamless workflows. Minutes later, that person may feel compelled to buy organizational tools or stationery. They may not even recall the exact video that planted the seed. The impression itself was enough. Their brain connected order with objects, and the urge followed naturally. A participant in one study admitted, "When I see someone living the way I wish I did, I buy something small to feel like I'm at least moving toward it." The purchase is symbolic. It represents motion, a step, even if tiny, toward a life that appears calmer or more intentional. The object doesn't contain the feeling, yet the act of choosing it brings a sense of progression. This sense of progression is addictive, especially for people who feel stuck or stagnant. Another psychological mechanism emerges here: identity rehearsal. When the brain meets a version of life that looks appealing, it begins to imagine how it would feel to embody that lifestyle. The shopper rehearses a new identity in their mind, The person with a clean desk, a curated wardrobe, a soothing evening routine. The purchase becomes the first chapter of that imagined identity. This is why social media spending often clusters around specific categories. Soft textures, calming colors, minimalistic objects, wellness items, aesthetic decor. These are not random choices. They are props in the identity the feed encourages the shopper to practice. Imagine someone watching a slow, atmospheric video of a morning ritual. Quiet music, sunlight, gentle movement. For a few seconds, the viewer steps into that atmosphere. When the video ends, a subtle longing lingers. The person begins searching for small ways to recapture that feeling. A ceramic mug, a linen robe, a diffuser, not to imitate the influencer, but to preserve the emotional tone that the video created. This effect becomes stronger when the viewer feels disconnected from their own routines. If their morning feels rushed, their evening cluttered, or their closet inconsistent, the curated content amplifies that dissonance. Spending becomes a form of emotional editing, a way to clean up the parts of their life that feel blurry or chaotic. In many cases, people don't realize they are reacting emotionally. They believe they are making practical improvements. My lighting is too harsh. I do need a better robe. Maybe a new shelf would help? But when researchers compared shopping logs to content exposure, the overlap was unmistakable. The purchases reflected moods, colors, and themes from what the person had seen earlier the same day. One participant described it as the feeling that the object completes a sentence I didn't finish. A profound line, because it shows that emotional spending after social media is about filling small inner gaps, not acquiring things. The issue is not that the feed shows beauty or aspiration. The issue is the speed. The brain receives hundreds of small emotional impressions in minutes. It cannot process them fully, so it reacts impulsively instead. The impressions become urges, the urges become decisions, and decisions become purchases. However, there is a moment of clarity available to anyone who learns to notice the shift. This moment appears right after the scroll stops, when the person puts down their phone and feels a slight pressure inside their chest, a restlessness that was not there before, a desire to adjust something, a sense of being almost satisfied with life, but not quite. Catching that moment is everything, because once it's noticed, the spell breaks. The person realizes the urge did not originate from their own values or goals. It originated from the comparison engine in their pocket. When that recognition settles, the feed loses its ability to dictate purchases. The images remain beautiful. The inspiration remains real. But the shopper stays rooted in themselves, rather than drifting into someone else's edited world. Chapter 7. The Boredom Trigger. When the mind buys just to feel alive, boredom is often misunderstood. People think it is an empty state, a blankness, a pause between more important moments. In reality, boredom is a low-level craving for stimulation. The mind reaching out its hand, looking for something to hold. When the day feels flat, predictable, or emotionally monotone, the brain begins to search for sparks. And in the modern world, those sparks often appear on a glowing screen filled with items designed to create tiny jolts of novelty. Studies show that 38% of people make unnecessary purchases when they feel bored. The urge doesn't arrive dramatically. It arrives like a slow tide. A person sits on the couch after finishing dinner, flips through channels, opens and closes apps, glances around the room without seeing anything meaningful. The body is still, but the mind hums with a faint restlessness, a sense that something should be happening, even if they don't know what. During these moments, online shopping becomes a kind of self-created activity. It creates movement where the evening feels stagnant. The scrolling, the variety, the colors, the infinite possibilities. All of it acts like a small rush of energy. A tired mind searches for reward. A bored mind searches for change. Shopping gives both. Imagine someone lying in bed, the ceiling dim above them, phone screen casting a soft glow. They are not sad. They are not stressed. They are simply unstimulated. Their thoughts drift, unfocused. The day didn't offer anything exciting or challenging, and the brain feels underfed. Then the store app opens almost automatically. The first item appears, a water bottle in a new color, then a graphic tee, then a novelty lamp shaped like the moon. Each one creates a spark, a flicker, a tiny pulse of life. The person isn't thinking about practicality. They're thinking about how the object feels in this exact second. Boredom triggers a desire for novelty, and novelty lives in the world of shopping interfaces. A participant in a long-term study described it this way. When my day feels empty, looking at things makes me feel like something is happening. That line reveals everything. Shopping becomes a substitute for experience, a way to simulate movement in a still environment. Neurologists have a term for this: dopamine drift. When life lacks stimulation, the brain begins lowering its threshold, meaning even small novelty shocks feel disproportionately rewarding. A scented candle in a new fragrance suddenly feels exciting. A gadget that promises a twist on an everyday task feels thrilling. A quirky piece of home decor feels like a moment of discovery. All of these items activate the brain's novelty circuitry, giving a brief sense of aliveness. But boredom has another trick. It makes the brain underestimate consequences. A bored mind doesn't think far ahead. It focuses on the immediate shift in sensation. That is why someone can spend $50 on items they'll forget next week. The purchase wasn't for the future. It was for the mood. Picture a weekend afternoon. Someone wanders from room to room, not knowing what to do with the hours. They open their phone. A few minutes later, the world rushes in. Vibrant, colorful, stimulating. 10 tabs open, 5 items compared, 3 added to the cart. Not because they were needed, but because the process itself filled the empty space in time. There is another layer to boredom-based spending that surprises many people. The desire for a story. When life feels repetitive, a small purchase creates a momentary narrative. A new candle for a cozier evening. A new notebook for a fresh start. A new gadget to make tomorrow feel easier. The object represents a micro-beginning, a spark of potential injected into an otherwise predictable day. Emotionally, the purchase functions like a scene change, a transition, a shift. The cart becomes a doorway between one mood and another. Understanding this does not make boredom disappear, yet it gives insight into why spending feels strangely comforting during flat moments. The brain isn't searching for objects. It's searching for vividness. And the moment that becomes clear, the entire landscape of impulse buying begins to shift. Boredom changes shape depending on where someone is and what their day lacked. Sometimes it settles during a long wait, the kind of wait that stretches time until every minute feels twice as slow. A person might stand in a line that barely moves, glance around, and feel their mind flatten. There is no irritation, no urgency, just a quiet emptiness that asks to be filled. When this happens, the brain becomes unusually receptive to any form of stimulation that promises even a mild sense of direction. One researcher described boredom as a vacuum of intention. When intention disappears, the mind grabs whatever passes through its field of vision. And online stores are experts at moving through that field. Imagine someone sitting on a bus or train, the city sliding past the windows like a muted film. The rhythm of the ride lulls them into a half-aware state. Conversations around them are distant hums. Their thoughts drift without landing anywhere concrete. There is no purpose to the moment, only passage. Then the store app icon catches the eye, a tiny square of color in a sea of gray. The person taps it without enthusiasm, without curiosity, almost as a reflex to the monotony. And the moment the first product appears, the brain wakes up. The shift is subtle but familiar. The quiet heaviness recedes just enough to feel like something is happening. A set of pastel pens, a small tabletop fountain, a rotating spice rack. None of these objects answer a need. They answer the desire for a micro-event, something distinct enough to disrupt the stillness. In interviews, participants often describe these moments with surprising honesty. "I buy when nothing in the day stands out," one person said. "It feels like adding a highlight where there wasn't one." This is the true power of boredom-driven spending. The purchase becomes a highlight. It injects color into a colorless stretch of time. Boredom also sharpens sensitivity to novelty. A bored mind becomes a collector of possibilities. Even the smallest variation, a new texture, a new scent, a new shape, feels amplified. The brain, deprived of stimulation, expands the emotional impact of anything that breaks sameness. A silicone kitchen tool can feel strangely captivating. A tiny desk plant can feel inspiring. A keychain shaped like an animal can feel whimsical enough to buy instantly. Another layer of the boredom impulse unfolds during moments of passive waiting. Waiting rooms, airport gates, traffic jams, muted lunch breaks at work. These pockets of stalled time create a psychological tension. The body cannot act, the mind cannot engage fully, and the hours cannot be used meaningfully. In this limbo, the brain begins searching for agency, something it can control, something it can choose. Shopping becomes that actionable point. The decision to buy becomes the only moment in an otherwise static period where the person feels movement of their own making. One participant described an afternoon in an airport. "I wasn't excited or stressed. I was just suspended. Buying a book stand made me feel like I was moving forward again." Forward, that is the key word. Boredom creates the illusion of standing still. Purchases create the illusion of motion. But the motion fades quickly. The spark that felt energizing returns to neutrality once the environment changes. The person steps off the bus, leaves the waiting room, boards the flight, and the object that looked compelling minutes ago loses its glow. The emotion dissolves because the boredom dissolved. The connection between the two becomes obvious only in hindsight. A deeper psychological mechanism also appears: story projection. When bored, the mind begins projecting miniature storylines onto objects. A new mug becomes a cozier morning. A new shirt becomes a different version of myself on Friday. A new phone case becomes something playful to break the routine. The object becomes a scene, not a thing. People shop for the scene. This is why so many boredom purchases look strange later, not embarrassing, just disconnected. The buyer wasn't choosing items. They were choosing micro-stories to make the hour feel less flat. Yet the most fascinating part of boredom-driven spending is how easy it is to interrupt once someone notices the early signs. The first signal is rarely the urge to buy. It appears sooner, a wave of mental drift, a sense of hovering, a desire for something, anything, to happen. When a person recognizes that sensation, the origin becomes clear. The urge did not come from the object. It came from the mood. And when the mood is identified, it becomes easier to choose consciously rather than reflexively. Because boredom isn't asking for things. Boredom is asking for engagement, for aliveness, for variation, for meaning. And objects cannot supply meaning. They can only imitate its outline. Chapter 8. The debt you don't feel. When stress turns numbers into fog. Financial choices rarely happen in the calm, thoughtful moments people imagine. They occur in the small emotional gaps of daily life, the ones filled with tension, scattered thoughts, and the constant pressure to stay composed. When stress rises, the mind begins to protect itself in ways that are invisible from within. It narrows focus. It filters out long-term consequences. It prioritizes relief over reflection. Under these conditions, debt becomes something muted and distant, as if wrapped in a soft layer of fog. Researchers describe this shift as cognitive narrowing, a process where the brain reduces complexity to help the person cope with emotional overload. The mind stops evaluating numbers in the context of weeks or months. Instead, it focuses on the next few minutes, the next breath, the next feeling that might bring even a small sense of ease. The weight of a future payment becomes too abstract to influence the decision in front of them. Imagine someone closing their laptop after a demanding workday. Their shoulders feel tight, their attention flickers, and their thoughts move without rhythm. Emails sit unanswered, deadlines loom, and the body carries a subtle tension that does not fully release. In this fog, a message appears on their phone. A special offer, a seasonal discount, a small luxury item they have looked at before. The person does not decide to spend. The decision forms by itself, shaped by the need for something that softens the emotional intensity of the moment. The emotional landscape at times like this becomes narrow and reactive. A purchase feels less like a choice and more like a small exhale, a way to create a pocket of comfort inside a stressful day. The brain gravitates toward anything that feels immediate, predictable, and gentle. Debt, on the other hand, feels distant and undefined, almost like a future weather forecast that does not belong to the present self. Behavioral economists often describe emotional debt accumulation as a sequence of unregistered decisions. These decisions rarely feel dramatic. They rarely feel risky. Instead, they slip quietly into the day, blending with dozens of other small actions taken under pressure. Each one feels harmless. Each one feels temporary. Each one feels justified by the emotional load carried in that moment. A participant in a long-term study described this dynamic with striking clarity. When I am stressed, the future version of me feels more capable than the present one. So I shift responsibilities onto him without realizing it. This phenomenon is known as future self-displacement. The mind unconsciously assigning consequences to an imagined version of oneself who will supposedly be calmer, stronger, and better equipped to handle them. Stress makes this imagined version of the self feel limitless. During periods of emotional strain, the brain also experiences a distortion in time perception. Moments stretch. Tasks feel heavier. The idea of planning becomes exhausting. When the mind cannot comfortably think ahead, it leans towards soothing impulses. A small purchase seems manageable because it does not require strategic thinking. It offers closure, simplicity, and a fleeting sense of reward at a time when everything else demands effort. Picture someone grocery shopping after a challenging afternoon. Their cart moves slowly, their thoughts drift in and out of focus, and their emotional energy feels thin. The last aisle contains small indulgences. Skincare items, scented products, miniature accessories. These objects are inexpensive enough to feel safe and comforting enough to override the stress temporarily. In this mindset, the boundary between can afford and should postpone becomes less defined. The brain chooses relief because relief appears attainable. Financial awareness weakens under emotional tension. Emotional relief strengthens under the same tension. Debt grows where these two lines quietly intersect. The pattern becomes even more pronounced for people who experience chronic stress. When the nervous system remains activated for long periods, the threshold for impulse decisions lowers. The brain begins to value emotional ease above rational planning. Purchases are no longer about the object. They are about reclaiming a sense of control in a world that feels unpredictable. In these moments, debt does not feel like an active threat. It feels like something weightless, something suspended in the distance, something that belongs to a timeline disconnected from the present moment. This emotional disconnection allows debt to grow without resistance. The most revealing part of this pattern appears when people reflect on it later. The majority do not remember the individual purchases clearly. They remember the emotional tone, the exhaustion, the pressure, the sense of holding everything together. The purchases were attempts to create brief pockets of comfort inside an overcrowded day. And those pockets felt necessary at the time. Understanding this psychological blind spot marks the beginning of change. Because once a person recognizes that stress alters financial perception, turning numbers into fog, they begin to see the debt they could not feel before. Stress alters more than financial perception. It reshapes the emotional landscape where decisions are made. When pressure accumulates for days or weeks, the mind begins reorganizing priorities. Comfort moves upward. Clarity moves downward. Everyday responsibilities continue, yet beneath the surface, the nervous system works overtime, balancing tension, uncertainty, and the constant effort to appear composed. In this environment, spending often becomes a quiet coping mechanism rather than a deliberate act. One of the most overlooked dynamics appears during long stretches of emotional fatigue. When someone carries unresolved worries about work, about relationships, about health, about expectations, the mind instinctively seeks small anchors to stabilize itself. These anchors often take the form of repeat purchases, familiar brands, familiar categories, familiar small luxuries. The emotional predictability of these items feels soothing, even when the person does not consciously recognize the pattern. Researchers describe this as stability substitution. When internal stability weakens, people reach for external symbols of steadiness. A favorite candle scent, a premium snack, a stylish notebook, a comfortable accessory. These items act as emotional placeholders, creating a sense of normalcy in a period that feels mentally uneven. Imagine someone returning home after a set of complicated responsibilities that demanded constant decision-making. Their mind feels stretched thin, as if every thought takes additional effort. They move mechanically through their evening routine, yet their attention does not settle anywhere. It drifts. They open a familiar shopping platform, not for novelty, but for reassurance. The items they gravitate toward are not random. They carry a familiar emotional signature. Purchasing them creates a brief sense of grounding, a moment where something feels stable. During extended stress, another mechanism appears: emotional compression. The brain compresses multiple feelings: frustration, fear, disappointment, fatigue, into a single sensation that sits heavily in the background. This compressed emotion rarely gets processed directly. Instead, the mind attempts to relieve it through micro-pleasures that feel gentle and controllable. A small purchase becomes a way to express care toward oneself, when emotional expression feels difficult or unavailable. A participant in a multi-year behavioral study wrote, "Buying something small made me feel like I was finally doing one thing for myself, even when I had no space to deal with everything else. The feeling of care outweighed the practical value of the item." Another dimension of stress-based spending emerges when the person feels emotionally disconnected from their long-term goals. When stress dominates the present, the future loses emotional warmth. Savings goals, financial plans, and budgeting intentions begin to feel distant, almost theoretical. This emotional distance weakens the instinct to protect long-term stability. The brain prioritizes emotional regulation over future structure, creating a fertile space for impulsive spending. Imagine someone sitting in their car after a demanding appointment. The engine is off, the air feels still, and their mind refuses to transition into the next task. They feel suspended, too drained to move forward, too tense to rest. During those suspended minutes, a small purchase can feel like the only manageable action available. It provides a sense of completion when the rest of the day feels unfinished. There is also a social element at play. When people are under prolonged stress, they often compare their internal chaos with the apparent composure of others. This quiet form of self-judgment creates additional tension, pushing the mind toward small compensations that offer emotional relief. Buying something comforting, beautiful, or symbolic becomes a way to close the gap between how they feel and how they believe they should feel. Yet the most revealing insight appears when people reflect on these purchases. They rarely regret the item itself. They regret the state of mind that led to it. The overwhelming day, the fatigue, the uncertainty, the emotional pressure they carried without language. Most people do not overspend because they are careless. They overspend because they are tired, overloaded, and searching for softness in a moment that feels too sharp. Debt grows in these conditions not because someone ignores it deliberately, but because the emotional weight of the present moment eclipses the psychological weight of the future. The mind prioritizes survival of the moment, even at the cost of tomorrow's clarity. And this survival instinct is powerful enough to shape a person's financial reality without ever announcing its presence. Recognizing this dynamic does more than prevent new debt. It reveals the emotional architecture behind financial behavior, the tension, the fatigue, the quiet longing for stability that drives many of the choices people believe are purely practical. When this architecture becomes visible, the fog begins to lift, and the person can finally see the patterns that once controlled them from the shadows. Chapter 9. The Morning Mirror. When sunrise reveals emotional spending, morning light has a way of revealing what the night concealed. It arrives quietly, touches familiar objects, and restores a kind of clarity that was unavailable hours earlier. For many people, this clarity brings a subtle emotional shift. A moment when a recent purchase feels different from how it felt the evening before. The item has not changed, yet its meaning has. This shift is one of the clearest signs that the decision was emotional rather than intentional. Researchers who study chronobiological patterns of decision-making often compare nighttime choices with choices made after sunrise. During late hours, the brain operates under a distinct chemical landscape. Reduced serotonin, fluctuating glucose, elevated reward sensitivity, and decreased executive control. The mind seeks comfort, reassurance, and relief from the residue of the day. Purchases made in this state often reflect the emotion of the moment rather than the person's deeper priorities. By morning, the internal environment is completely different. Cortisol rises naturally, sharpening awareness. Neural circuits linked to evaluation and planning reactivate. The emotional fog dissolves. The person sees the world and the purchase through a more grounded lens. Imagine someone stepping into their living room as the day begins. The room feels cooler, quieter, and more structured than it did the night before. On the table sits a package they ordered recently, wrapped neatly, carrying the memory of a feeling that already feels distant. They pause, holding their cup, and sense a slight mismatch between who they are now and who they were the moment the buy button was pressed. The mismatch is gentle rather than dramatic, yet unmistakable. This is the morning mirror, the moment when the emotional origin of a purchase becomes visible. A participant in a long-term study once described this experience with unusual precision. I wake up with a different version of myself, and she sees the purchase differently. The distinction is not poetic. It is neurological. Evening emotions create a temporary self-state, a short-lived configuration of mood, hormones, and cognitive fatigue. Purchases made during that state are aligned with that momentary self. When morning arrives, the emotional state dissolves, leaving the physical evidence of a decision the current self did not fully endorse. Morning regret does not always feel like shame. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet curiosity. Sometimes as a faint discomfort. Sometimes as a question without judgment. These sensations arise because the conscious mind is finally able to evaluate the decision without the noise of the previous evening. Another mechanism adds depth to this pattern. Overnight, the brain reorganizes emotional data through several neurological cycles. It sorts experiences, integrates memory fragments, and stabilizes mood. By dawn, the emotional charge that drove the purchase is usually gone. The person views the item without the emotional filter that once made it appear comforting, exciting, or necessary. This contrast creates a psychological echo, a recognition that the decision did not come from stable desire. It came from an emotional impulse. And this recognition is one of the clearest signs of emotional spending. Consider someone opening their email after breakfast. A receipt from a late-night purchase sits at the top of the inbox. They read it slowly, trying to recall the exact feeling that led them there. For a brief moment, they can sense the version of themselves who needed comfort or distraction the night before. Yet the emotion feels distant, almost abstract, as if it belonged to another layer of their personality. The purchase exposes the separation between transient emotional states and long-term values. Financial psychologists emphasize that this morning contrast is not a sign of irresponsibility. It is a sign of emotional mismatch, a core indicator that the decision came from mood, not intention. When this pattern repeats, it becomes one of the strongest diagnostic markers of emotional spending. The morning mirror does not judge. It reveals. It shows the parts of a person that needed gentleness during the previous evening and the emotions they did not have words for. And once this pattern becomes clear, it becomes significantly easier to recognize the emotional origins of future impulses. As the morning unfolds, the shift between emotional impulse and conscious awareness becomes more pronounced. It does not happen instantly upon waking. It emerges gradually during the small transitions that shape the early hours of the day. Someone might be riding an elevator, waiting for a kettle to boil, checking a calendar, or walking toward their car. Their mind begins aligning with familiar responsibilities, steady rhythms, and the version of themselves that plans, evaluates, and follows long-term intentions. During these ordinary transitions, a late-night purchase often resurfaces in an unexpected way. Perhaps it appears as a shipping notification, a transaction alert, or a pending charge on a banking app. The moment is brief, yet striking. The person feels the contrast between their present clarity and the emotional state that shaped the decision hours earlier. The item now appears through the lens of structure, goals, and daily priorities, a lens that was not accessible the previous night. Financial researchers describe this shift as identity convergence. Throughout the day, various selves, the stressed self, the tired self, the hopeful self, the responsible self, begin aligning into a single cohesive identity. Purchases made under emotional intensity stand out because they were chosen by a self that existed only for a short moment. The morning version of the person sees this with increasing precision as the day takes shape. Imagine someone stepping into a quiet hallway between meetings. Their mind is focused on upcoming tasks and deadlines. A notification lights their screen with an order confirmation from the previous night. The item feels strangely disconnected from the tone of the day. The person pauses, experiencing a subtle sense of distance, almost as if they are observing the decision rather than remembering making it. The purchase becomes a doorway into an emotional landscape that no longer exists. Morning clarity also reveals the emotional intentions behind the decision. With the noise of the previous evening gone, the person can finally sense the feeling that guided them. The heaviness of stress, the residue of an unresolved conversation, the need for comfort at the end of a demanding day. The purchase becomes a clue rather than a mistake, pointing toward the emotional pressure that shaped the moment. This recognition often brings an unexpected mixture of emotions. There may be a quiet embarrassment or a faint dissatisfaction. Yet beneath that lies something more meaningful: understanding. The person realizes that the decision was not irrational. It was emotional. And emotions, especially when unresolved, have a logic of their own. Another dynamic emerges later in the morning, when routines settle and the mind enters a more organized state. People begin reflecting on their upcoming goals for the week. Saving for a trip, reducing clutter, managing daily expenses, or simply creating a calmer environment. Within that context, the late-night purchase stands out even more clearly. It feels disconnected from these goals, almost like a message left by someone passing through. A participant in a multi-year behavioral study described the experience in a striking way. By midday, I can see exactly which part of me made the purchase, because she shows up only when I am overwhelmed. This insight captures the deeper truth behind the morning mirror. It is not about the item. It is about recognizing the emotional self that shaped the decision. As the day continues, this perspective becomes stronger. Meetings, conversations, and small successes build momentum. The person reconnects with the version of themselves that acts with purpose and direction. The emotional intensity of the previous night fades farther into the background. The purchase becomes a marker, a reminder of how emotion can shape behavior when awareness is dimmed. Financial psychologists emphasize that this recognition is a powerful turning point in emotional spending. When someone can see the exact moment their emotional self took over, they begin noticing patterns with increasing clarity. They start predicting when their mind becomes most vulnerable to soothing impulses. They learn to identify the emotional states that drift into spending behavior. The morning mirror becomes more than a moment of regret. It becomes a tool, a way to understand emotional triggers, anticipate vulnerable states, and build a sense of continuity between the self of the night and the self of the day. When these selves begin to communicate rather than compete, the emotional buyer loses influence. Chapter 10. The pattern you carry. When your brain reveals the truth before you do. Every emotional buyer believes their choices are isolated. A stressful evening here, a lonely night there, a moment of boredom, a flash of irritation, a scroll through social media, a small reward after a long day. Each purchase seems independent, shaped by a mood too brief to examine closely. Yet beneath these scattered moments lies a single, consistent pattern, a signature written in the rhythm of the nervous system. Neuroscientists describe this pattern as emotional mapping. The brain records experiences not only through memory, but through the echoes they leave in decision pathways. When someone repeatedly buys during specific emotional states, their brain develops well-traveled routes, shortcuts between feelings and purchases. These shortcuts are subtle. The person rarely notices them until the consequences accumulate. But the brain notices them long before the person does. Imagine someone moving through their week. On Monday, exhaustion settles in after hours of obligation. The mind feels heavy, and a small indulgence seems harmless. On Wednesday, a moment of social comparison triggers a quiet desire to catch up. On Friday, boredom opens a doorway to novelty seeking. Each moment feels unrelated, yet all share the same neurological thread. The decision emerges from an emotion rather than intention. This is what emotional spending looks like from within. A collection of micro-moments that feel separate but are deeply connected. A participant in a comprehensive behavioral study described the revelation with striking clarity. I thought I had 10 different spending problems, but they were all the same emotion wearing different outfits. That realization is the beginning of awareness. The brain does not hide emotional patterns out of malice. It hides them because it prioritizes immediate relief over long-term coherence. It assumes the person needs soothing more than understanding. And so it delivers relief through the most accessible pathway. The small, frictionless act of buying something that feels momentarily comforting. Over time, this process becomes predictable. Emotional buyers rarely notice the first sign, but their brain does. The stir of frustration, the ache of loneliness, the slow flattening of boredom, the heaviness of stress, the fog of fatigue, the sting of comparison. Before the person forms a conscious thought, their nervous system has already activated the pathways that once led to relief. The urge begins before the story does. This chapter marks a different kind of recognition. The awareness that the pattern repeats, not because the person is careless, but because their emotional states follow a reliable rhythm. The body signals discomfort in consistent ways. The brain offers relief in consistent ways. Purchases become the visible tip of an emotional architecture that has silently shaped decisions for years. Financial psychologists refer to this architecture as the emotional buyer's blueprint. It appears across cultures, ages, and income levels. It emerges during periods of stress and during periods of calm. It influences people who see themselves as impulsive and people who see themselves as disciplined. The blueprint is universal because the emotional brain is universal. One of the most revealing aspects of emotional spending is how early the brain recognizes the impulse. Before the person opens a store app, before they even reach for their phone or their card, the emotional circuitry has already shifted. Heart rate changes slightly. Breathing deepens or quickens. Attention narrows. The mind begins searching for something familiar, something soothing, something predictable. The purchase is not the beginning of the impulse. It is the end. Now the pattern becomes clear. Emotional spending is not a collection of scattered incidents. It is a system with reliable triggers, a system with consistent emotional fingerprints, a system the brain has practiced repeatedly until it became efficient. Recognizing this removes the mystery from the behavior. The person begins seeing the moment where their emotional state takes the lead. They notice the early signs more quickly. They start predicting the impulse instead of being surprised by it. The most empowering part of this awareness is not judgment. It is recognition. Because recognition gives the brain a new pathway. Something besides the old shortcut. Something besides the familiar reflex. And once recognition appears, emotional spending loses its invisibility. The pattern becomes clearest when someone steps back and notices how each emotional trigger forms a small fragment of a larger internal map. A single purchase during stress feels random. A purchase during loneliness feels unrelated. A purchase during boredom appears harmless. Yet together, they outline a repeating path. A route the brain travels whenever emotional pressure builds faster than awareness can keep up. Neuroscientists studying emotional decision-making often describe this route as a sequence of predictable internal shifts. The process begins long before the purchase. It begins when the nervous system signals discomfort through subtle cues. A restless breath, a tightening in the chest, a drifting mind, a sense that the day has lost its shape. These early sensations rarely attract attention. They feel like background noise, barely noticeable above the routine demands of life. As emotional intensity grows, the brain activates a familiar solution, a quick way to modify the internal state without confronting its origin. Shopping becomes that shortcut, not because the person wants objects, but because the act itself feels like movement, agency, and relief. Over time, the shortcut becomes efficient. The brain builds faster connections between emotion and action, making the impulse feel more natural than intentional. Imagine someone standing in line at a cafe, scrolling through their phone to fill the small silence between tasks. The morning has already placed demands on them, and their attention feels scattered. A longing for ease settles in. Gentle, barely noticeable, yet persuasive. Without a clear decision, their fingers move through familiar icons until a store page appears. The moment looks harmless from the outside, but internally it reflects a deeply practiced pattern. Emotion rising, relief being sought, and the brain guiding the person toward the path it has traveled many times before. This is the essence of the emotional buyer's blueprint. It is not chaotic. It is structured. It is reliable enough that researchers can predict spending impulses with surprising accuracy when emotional conditions align in specific ways. Financial psychologists observing these patterns emphasize that recognition is the most powerful turning point. Awareness interrupts automatic behavior by placing a small pause between feeling and action. The moment someone notices the pattern emerging, the shift in breath, the narrowing of focus, the familiar drift toward relief, the reflex loses a portion of its momentum. A participant in a 4-year study described the turning point with remarkable precision. I started recognizing the moment when my mind leaned toward the thing that changes nothing but feels like something. This sentence captures the core of Chapter 10. Emotional spending is not fundamentally about money. It is about the search for immediate emotional modulation. Purchases imitate change. Purchases imitate progress. Purchases imitate comfort. But the emotional trigger remains untouched beneath the surface. Once the blueprint becomes visible, the person discovers that they are not dealing with 10 different problems. They are dealing with a single internal mechanism expressed in 10 different emotional contexts. Stress, loneliness, boredom, comparison, anger, fatigue, and the rest all follow the same structure. Emotional discomfort, cognitive narrowing, desire for immediate relief, impulse purchase, temporary soothing, long-term disconnect. Recognizing the structure does not erase the impulse, but it changes its power. The person begins seeing the earliest signs. They begin naming their internal states with greater clarity. They notice the precise moment when relief begins calling for attention, and they learn to pause long enough to understand the feeling before acting on it. This awareness becomes the foundation for change. Before new habits appear, before practical tools are introduced, before rules are adopted, the person gains something far more important: the ability to see themselves without distortion. The emotional buyer's blueprint stops being invisible. It becomes readable. And once it becomes readable, it becomes possible to rewrite it. Chapter 11. The Shift. 5 actions that break the emotional impulse. Emotional impulses rarely appear because a person truly wants an object. They form when the nervous system reaches a point where it needs movement, change, or relief, even in the smallest dose. The brain searches for a quick transition between emotional discomfort and emotional stability, and shopping becomes the easiest bridge because it requires no planning, no negotiation, and no vulnerability. A purchase feels like a shift, even when the shift lasts only moments. However, the same sense of internal movement can be created through small physical or sensory actions that interrupt the impulse before it becomes a transaction. These actions are simple, fast, and accessible, and they give the brain the change it is seeking without leading to a purchase that will feel misaligned hours later. Psychologists refer to these actions as micro-regulators because they gently redirect the emotional surge without suppressing it. Emotional impulses follow a predictable sequence. The body registers tension, the mind narrows its focus, and the urge to buy appears as a way to restore equilibrium. When the body receives an alternative action, something that signals safety, variation, or presence, the impulse softens naturally. It does not collapse completely, yet it loses the sharpness that makes the decision feel urgent. What follows are 5 actions that interrupt the earliest phase of the emotional impulse. Each requires little time, little effort, and no preparation, and each creates the kind of internal movement the brain mistakes for the feeling of buying. Walking is one of the simplest ways to interrupt an impulse. A short, deliberate change of space, even a sequence of 30 steps in a straight line, gives the nervous system a sense of forward motion. Emotional pressure often creates a feeling of being trapped inside a moment or a room, and the body interprets that tension as a need to escape. Shopping imitates escape. Walking creates it. A brief physical shift stabilizes breathing, calms the internal tempo, and allows the mind to step out of the narrowness that fuels impulsive decisions. Another micro-regulator is human connection. Emotional spending frequently hides a quiet longing for presence rather than a desire for possessions. A short call to one trusted person, even one that lasts less than a minute, reorganizes the emotional state quickly because the sound of another voice alters the rhythm of the nervous system. Social contact reduces the intensity of the impulse by giving the brain the type of soothing it was originally seeking, which makes the act of buying feel less necessary. Temperature shifts also carry surprising power. A few seconds of cool water on the face or hands influences the vagal pathways that regulate emotional arousal. The sensation interrupts the loop of rising tension and grounds the person in physical awareness. This kind of grounding sharply reduces the momentum of an impulse because it provides the body with a clear, immediate marker that change has already occurred. Aromatic signals work in a similar way. Preparing a cup of tea or coffee, or simply breathing in a familiar scent, activates the limbic regions associated with emotional comfort. The sensory detail becomes a focal point that pulls attention away from the spiral of the impulse. This small ritual delivers a sense of care and completion that often replaces the need to seek comfort through a purchase. Music offers a 5th pathway. 5 minutes of listening to a piece that matches the emotional tone or gently shifts it creates a measurable effect on heart rate, breath pattern, and cognitive tempo. The mind interprets musical rhythm as a structured form of movement, and this structure breaks the urgency that accompanies impulsive spending. By the time the piece ends, the emotional wave has already changed shape, and the impulse feels less convincing. These 5 actions do not require willpower. They do not demand discipline. They simply give the emotional impulse somewhere else to go. Once the person experiences this change, even once, the brain begins relearning its own responses, and the cycle that once felt automatic becomes something that can be redirected with ease. The true power of these micro-regulators becomes visible only when someone pays attention to the moment just before the impulse emerges. Emotional spending does not begin with the thought of buying. It begins with a shift in the body, a tightening of attention, a drop in mental spaciousness, or a sense that the present moment has become slightly too heavy or too flat. The early signs often feel subtle, almost harmless, yet they carry the entire weight of the decision that follows. When a person learns to recognize these signals, the 5 actions from this chapter become more than simple techniques. They become a way to interrupt the emotional chain at its first link. Each micro-regulator works because it changes the internal narrative without forcing discipline. Emotional impulses thrive on momentum. They grow stronger when a person tries to suppress them and weaker when the nervous system is given something else to respond to. The walk shifts the tempo of the body. The call provides a sense of relational safety. The cool water sends a grounding signal through the vagal pathways. The scent creates sensory coherence. The music resets the emotional rhythm. None of these actions confront the impulse directly. Instead, they create a small redirection, which softens the emotional urgency and restores a sense of choice. People often assume that emotional spending requires drastic solutions or strict rules. Yet the nervous system rarely responds well to harsh interventions. It responds to gentle transitions, especially during states of heightened emotion. This is why these 5 actions work even for those who have spent years trying to change their spending patterns without success. They do not punish the impulse. They do not shame it. They simply meet the emotional need with an alternative that feels easier than buying. Imagine someone at the edge of an impulse, holding their phone without consciously deciding to open a store app. Their breathing has changed slightly, and their attention feels narrow, drawn toward the idea of a small purchase as if it promises instant clarity. At that moment, even the smallest shift, 30 steps, a cool splash of water, a familiar scent rising from a mug, changes the arc of the experience. The emotional pressure loses its sharpness, and the person can see the impulse from the outside rather than from inside its momentum. This moment, even if brief, restores the ability to choose, and choice is the foundation of every long-term change. Over time, something remarkable happens. The brain begins to anticipate the micro-regulator instead of the purchase. It starts forming new neural pathways that associate emotional discomfort with movement, contact, grounding, or sensory presence, rather than shopping. This transition does not require perfection. It requires repetition. Every time the person replaces the early stage of an impulse with one of these actions, the emotional circuitry adapts. The shortcut to buying loses some of its automatic authority, and a new shortcut begins to form. This chapter does not ask the reader to remove the impulse. It asks them to redirect it long enough for the nervous system to settle. Once awareness grows and the intensity of the urge fades, the rational part of the mind becomes accessible again, and the decision no longer feels predetermined. This is the beginning of genuine agency. The person discovers that their emotional world is not something to fight against, but something that can be guided with gentle markers that meet the nervous system where it is. When these micro-regulators become familiar, emotional spending shifts from an automatic pattern into a manageable signal. The impulse becomes a message rather than a command. And this message, once understood, opens the door to stability that does not depend on purchases, routines that do not collapse under emotion, and a sense of internal steadiness that can be carried into every part of life. Chapter 12. The 3 Rules of Freedom. A simpler life begins with smaller decisions. Lasting change rarely requires a dramatic reinvention of one's life. It begins with a few small boundaries that remain steady even when the emotional weather shifts. The micro-regulators from the previous chapter open space between feeling and action. Yet a person still needs a structure that will hold during evenings of fatigue, moments of loneliness, or days when clarity dissolves. A complicated system would collapse under emotional pressure, but 3 simple rules can withstand it, because each rule targets the exact stage of the impulse where emotional spending usually forms. They do not restrict desire. They protect intention. The first rule reshapes timing. Emotional impulses show their strongest influence during late hours, when the mind slows and the inner landscape becomes more vulnerable to temporary moods. Evening neurochemistry tilts the brain toward comfort, novelty, or quick emotional relief. And purchases made during this window often reflect a momentary self rather than the grounded one that appears at sunrise. By choosing to avoid discretionary spending after 8 in the evening, a person shields themselves from the hours most likely to distort perception. This boundary is gentle and surprisingly easy to maintain, because the brain adapts quickly to temporal cues that reduce cognitive load. Within days, the rule stops feeling like restriction and begins functioning as protection. The second rule softens urgency. Emotional spending gains force when the item appears fleeting or when the moment feels too narrow to wait. The pressure to act immediately inflates the emotional state that triggered the impulse in the first place. Saving the link and revisiting it the next morning gives the nervous system time to settle. And this short pause engages a different cognitive system, one built for evaluation, planning, and continuity. When the person looks again with a clearer mind, urgency usually dissolves, revealing whether the desire reflects a genuine preference or a temporary emotional need. A pause is not a denial. It is a lens. The third rule addresses the emotional root of many impulses by offering a realistic way to redirect the feeling without relying on a purchase. Some impulses emerge not from desire, but from a longing for warmth, presence, or simple human contact. Instead of buying something to fill that gap, the person can offer themselves a small moment of connection. This connection does not require a call or a long conversation. It can take the form of a brief message to someone they trust, a shared photo, a voice note, or even a small interaction online that reminds the nervous system it is not isolated. When the impulse comes from emotional distance rather than actual interest in an object, this subtle connection provides the soothing the mind was searching for. The rule is not about involving others in financial choices. It is about recognizing when an emotional need wants acknowledgement rather than consumption. Together, these 3 rules form a framework that requires very little effort and almost no discipline, because each one interrupts a different stage of the emotional spending cycle. They reduce vulnerability during late hours, dissolve urgency that distorts perception, and redirect emotional need towards sources that actually satisfy it. None of the rules resist emotion. They simply create a small, steady structure around the moments when the mind becomes most susceptible to impulses. Inside that structure, choice returns, clarity strengthens, and decisions begin to align with the person they want to be rather than the emotion they happen to feel. The impact of these 3 rules becomes most visible when they begin to work together rather than as isolated practices. Each rule addresses a different vulnerability. Yet the moment they overlap, the emotional landscape around spending starts to feel less chaotic and far more predictable. The person begins to recognize when evening chemistry distorts judgment, when urgency manipulates attention, and when loneliness or emotional distance disguises itself as desire for an object. The rules turn these once invisible moments into recognizable signals, and this recognition gradually replaces impulse with clarity. As the rules settle into daily life, a subtle shift appears. The person notices that they no longer rely on willpower to resist purchases because the structure carries part of the weight. The boundary around evening hours reduces the number of moments when emotional spending tends to arise. The pause before buying dissolves false urgency before it gains momentum. The small act of connection gives the emotional brain the warmth it often seeks in objects. Emotional pressure loses its intensity not through effort, but through redirection. And this redirection becomes familiar enough that the impulse feels less like a command and more like a suggestion. Change unfolds quietly, almost imperceptibly. A week of applying the rules does not feel transformative, yet small differences emerge. The cart stays empty a little more often. The morning mirror reveals fewer mismatches. The emotional buyer who once appeared automatically now enters the scene less frequently. And when he does, his voice is softer and easier to recognize. Financial therapists describe this phase as the period when a person begins building emotional continuity, meaning their decisions remain aligned with their deeper values, even during fluctuating moods. Over time, the rules begin shaping something larger than behavior. They create internal trust. The person discovers that their emotions, even the complicated ones, do not need to be managed through consumption. They learn that discomfort can pass without being fixed, that boundaries can protect rather than restrict, and that connection, whether through a message, a gesture, or a moment of presence, can replace the sense of emptiness that once pushed them toward quick relief. This trust becomes a foundation for long-term stability, because emotional spending is rarely about money. It is about how the nervous system interprets emotional signals and how a person responds to those signals when clarity is thin. The most meaningful part of this shift is not the reduction in purchases. It is the emerging sense of freedom. Freedom from urgency. Freedom from late-night distortion. Freedom from the belief that relief must come from an object. As the three rules become a familiar rhythm, the person begins navigating their days with a steadier internal tempo, one that feels less reactive and more intentional. Decisions that once felt rushed now feel considered. Moments that once triggered indulgent purchases now invite gentler forms of care. The emotional pattern that shaped so many choices begins to lose its hold. What remains is something quieter. The ability to move through emotion without losing direction. The three rules do not promise perfection, nor do they demand it. They offer a small structure around the mind's most vulnerable moments, allowing the person to meet their emotions with presence instead of impulse. When this presence becomes habitual, the emotional buyer fades, and a steadier, more grounded version of the self steps forward, one capable of making choices that feel clear not only in the moment, but also in the morning light that follows. You now see the pattern, and the pattern no longer leads you. The journey through this book has not asked you to become a different person. It has asked you to become a clearer one. Every chapter revealed a moment when emotion shaped your choices without announcing its presence. And you have seen how quickly the mind reaches for relief when the day grows heavy or the evening loses its shape. Emotional spending once felt mysterious because the impulses appeared suddenly, asking for action before understanding. Now the pattern is no longer hidden. The architecture behind your decisions has become visible, and visibility is the beginning of freedom. You have learned that emotional impulses do not define you. They simply signal that a part of you is tired, overloaded, lonely, or seeking something real. You have seen how your brain changes its chemistry at night, how urgency distorts perception, and how the absence of connection can disguise itself as desire. None of these discoveries were made to create guilt. They were made to create recognition, because recognition gives your mind a moment of space, a small breath between feeling and action where clarity can reappear. The second part of this book offered the simplest tools possible, not because simplicity is easy, but because simplicity is sustainable. 5 small actions showed you how to redirect the emotional wave before it crests. 3 quiet rules formed a structure that protects you during the moments when judgment blurs and impulses intensify. These tools do not demand discipline. They offer gentleness. They give your nervous system what it was asking for all along: movement, presence, connection, and time. This new understanding does not erase emotion or prevent difficult days from arriving. It gives you a different relationship with those days. You now know the earliest signs of the impulse. You know how to soften its intensity before it grows. You know when to wait, when to ground yourself, and when to reach for even the smallest moment of connection. Every one of these shifts creates a new pathway in your mind. And these pathways grow stronger each time you choose presence instead of urgency. The freedom you are building is not loud. It does not require drastic change or sudden breakthroughs. It grows quietly through small decisions, each one aligned with the person you are becoming rather than the emotion you are passing through. With time, these decisions create a life that feels steadier and more intentional. A life where purchases reflect genuine desire instead of temporary states. You now see the pattern, and the pattern no longer leads you. You lead yourself. What happens from this moment forward is not a test and not a challenge. It is simply the next step in a direction you already understand. Start with the smallest shift this evening. Notice the earliest signal. Choose one action. Give yourself one gentle pause. These are not small gestures. They are the foundation of a new internal architecture, one built on clarity, trust, and the kind of freedom that does not fade with the morning light.